Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Aliffe.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Lynn Marie.
I was so glad that you were willing to come on because not only are you a physician, but you're also a scientist, so you really understand the confluence of those two areas because there are a lot of things happen in the lab that it's hard to translate to the clinic and
Yeah.
vice versa. So I'm very grateful that you've come on to talk to us a little bit about cannabis. What we are talking about today is specifically the non-CBD portions of cannabis. We have another episode if anybody wants to check out the CBD only episode. But if we could talk a little bit about, before we get started, about the types of evidence that exist and how people view these different types of evidence.
Okay. So much of the time, for instance, from medical and medicinal science people, there are often reports. In fact, I posted something on LinkedIn about it today that in the UK, there are complaints that there's not enough evidence around the use of cannabis in a medicinal context. But as I wrote there, that the medical industry has become accustomed to the pharmaceutical approach as a pharmaceutical standard. And so pharmaceuticals are very different from botanical medicines, and cannabis is in that botanical medicine space. Pharmaceuticals are synthetic molecules. You have no idea how toxic they'll be. They've never been given to humans before. So you have to have certain types of studies just to prove that you're not going to kill more people that you help. And so that sort of double blind, placebo controlled trial is something that you would do with a patented molecule that's invented by your company. When you have a botanical medicine or a botanical drug that is generically available to everyone, like coffee, for instance, you're not going to find anybody funding clinical trials. Coffee is a psychotropic medicinal plant that is widely consumed around the world, and it's very psychoactive. It has lots of behavioral and cognitive effects. And so, but would I say that there's not enough evidence that coffee enhances alertness, wakefulness, that sort of a thing? So the question about evidence and quality of evidence has to do with what sort of recommendations are being made, and also what sorts of generalizations are being made. But on the side of clinical trials for drugs, often clinical trials are conducted on populations that are very separate or very distinct or different from one's own patient population. So, Pfizer might do a clinical trial in Croatia and in Sri Lanka for a drug approval in the United States. And the pharmacogenetics and other maybe even unknown characteristics of those populations may not correlate with your own patient population. So the quality of evidence, it's important that clinicians kind of become students again, heaven forbid, but to pay attention to what is being recommended and on what basis.
Gotcha. And also we were talking a little bit before we recorded about how a lot of evidence in this space, because things have been either illegal or unavailable aside from small batches of research drugs, it's hard to have a lot of this, double blind, randomized control trial. And so people talk about anecdotal evidence. Can you speak a little bit
Right.
to anecdotal evidence?
Sure. Anecdotal evidence really is, to me, the basis of all science. So science is here to answer questions and to help us, improve life overall for human beings, maybe for the planet if we're smart enough. And lots of people poo-poo anecdotal evidence as though it is absolutely irrelevant, and it's not. Anecdotal evidence is a bunch of cavemen out running around, two guys, and one gets attacked by a saber-toothed tiger and killed, and the other one runs back. That's anecdotal. But for me, that's good enough. you know, how many trials do you need to run? It's like, okay, well, let's send out two more guys and see what happens. It's like, oh, well, our early observations let us know that the slowest guy ends up being eaten. Well, it's only been six people so far. We need to have an N value so that our P value is, and and so there are contexts in which it makes sense when you're trying to really dissect out a fine point. But anecdote is basically human experience. And interestingly, if you look at the word anecdote, it is defined as relating a factual experience. And then anecdotal, suddenly, when you look at that next entry down or up, I guess, in the dictionary, it becomes some sort of vague presupposition that is not supported by evidence. And it's like, wow, how can you go from a factual human experience to something that is no longer factual? That's part of that influence of the biotech and pharmaceutical science, medicinal science. There's a flaw in this culture where people don't like to believe what other people say. The reason you have a double-blind placebo-controlled trial is because science is cheap and people want to be right even if their data isn't right. And so that's where the problem comes in. So for me, anecdotal evidence is useful because medical practice is all anecdotal. It's not a controlled trial. It's a poorly controlled trial at best. And so people tend to learn from what they've learned and continue to build their clinical acumen based on actual experience. But all of that actual experience is anecdotal. As soon as you stand up and tell somebody, actually, I've helped several people just by giving them sparkling water, then it's an anecdote. Well, maybe it was 10,000 people. Well, did you monitor? Did you do this? Oh, it's retrospect. People, I understand the issues around the quality of the data, but it's not a dichotomous variable, valid versus invalid. And so, but on the context of people and helping people, anecdotal evidence is what guides us to start to understand what's actually occurring, and then you can nail down mechanisms and things like that with more specific studies.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. Now,
Sure.
before we get to what research has been done, if you could elucidate a bit about how THC and any of the other non-CBD cannabinoids you'd like to touch on, how they actually interact with the human body.
Okay, so specifically the cannabinoids, and led by THC. THC is the one that's paid most attention because it tends to be one of the two highest components as far as per weight, THC and CBD, and also because it triggers the psychoactive or intoxicating psychoactive response that is primarily associated with cannabis, marijuana, hashish, and all the other names in that cannabis family, cannabis products. They are fat-soluble molecules, and so they enter the body relatively easily, cross the blood-brain barrier relatively easily, depending on route of administration. And so they're able to affect lots of tissues throughout the body. The way that they are understood to work is by binding to a series of receptors that are actually already present within the human body as part of the endocannabinoid system. And of course, later it was discovered that the body produces its own cannabinoids, like anandamide. And so what occurs in the body, you have over 100 different cannabinoids, the activities of which haven't fully been nailed down. So THC, if the molecule is modified, say by exposure to light and air, like in storage, it can become cannabidiol, which tends to be more sedating and not as intoxicating as tetrahydrocannabinol. Excuse me, I said cannabidiol. I should have said cannabinol.
Gotcha.
And so THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, can become just simply cannabinol just by letting it sit in the sun or in the open air. That happens naturally as cannabis material ages, and that tends to have a more sedating effect and less of an intoxicating effect. Once THC is in the body, depending on the route of administration, but say, for instance, by smoking or eating, much of that THC circulates through the liver and gets modified to a different molecule, 11-hydroxy-THC, that apparently is responsible for the majority of the intoxicating effect. It's actually more intoxicating than THC itself, and there's some question of whether THC is actually what gets you high or just makes you kind of happy and relaxed.
Gotcha. Okay. And we talked a little bit back in the CBD episode about like the CB1 and CB2 receptors that CBD doesn't directly interact with, correct? But the other,
It does.
it modifies them, correct?
Right. Well, see, the modification it's a little bit strange. Once people have in their mind a priority, then they start saying, well, this one did it and that one modified it. And so, like in our, culture, we think that the CEO made the decision or the husband made the decision, and then the VP or the wife or someone else is like, oh, but they had some input too. And so once you've given priority to something like THC, then all of the analysis rotates around that central piece. But if you look at the data from a fresh viewpoint over again, it's clear that THC and CBD interact with receptors at the same time. Which one, the chicken and the egg sort of a thing, which one is first, which one is more important? That in the data, it's not actually evident. People's conclusions are based on the assumption that THC is the primary active component of cannabis because it gets people high. But what you find with CB1 and CB2 receptors, and CB1 receptors being the predominant form that are in the central nervous system in the brain, but also found in the periphery, and you'll often hear people make the mistake of saying that there are no CB2 receptors in the brain because they associate CB2 receptors with peripheral tissues and the immune system, that sort of thing. But both are actually in the brain. And what has been found is that sometimes they'll bind together and create one receptor. And that one receptor is binding or interacting, you could say, with CBD on one side and binding or interacting with THC on the other side. And it has a different effect on the cell that it's a part of than if the two receptors remain separate. So it's a fairly complex system, and it's not so easily reduced or dumbed down to pharmaceutical terms.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Now, if we could get into some of the studies, some of the work that has already been done, some things that THC or any of the, like I said, non-CBD cannabinoids have been shown in research to help with. We had discussed a little bit beforehand, there's some effects on fitness, PTSD, TBI. So wherever you'd like to start on that.
Okay, sure. So, well, you mentioned fitness. So there's a study by Marilyn Huestis, Huestis, and she was looking at concerns over the use of cannabis in sports, and specifically whether it should be prohibited, which was her recommendation. But the basis of her recommendation was because it's actually performance enhancing. And performance enhancing, though, in a natural, almost like nutritional way, in the same way that, a proper diet, proper exercise, having a good trainer, all of those are performance enhancing. Weight training is performance enhancing, and it works within the structure of the body. And this is the way that cannabis works. But she made reference, it was a review article, she made reference to several studies that showed that the ability of a human to optimize their use of oxygen, because that's the muscles run on oxygen, and people are breathing when they get out of breath, and the optimal performance is within a certain range of oxygen exchange function, muscle circulation, that whole context, and that it actually enhanced that function. It actually enhanced recovery. Not just from injury like sprains or muscle pulls, but just from intensive exercise where there's muscle soreness and the ability of an athlete to come back, maybe like say in college sports or professional athletes where they may have a morning and then an afternoon session, and everybody's fresh in the morning, and in the afternoon they may be sore from having pushed themselves so hard in the morning, and that cannabis actually helped people with that resilience, they called it, and speed of recovery. It also cognitively and psychologically was an enhancement with respect to cognitive awareness, with respect to visual field, and also with respect to what's called aversive behavior, meaning after someone has had a negative experience, maybe they're playing baseball and they just got hit by a baseball by the pitcher, or they're playing football and they just, the quarterback got sacked, it was a really hard sack. When people go back out in the field, when they're in that situation the next time around, it's natural as a human being to feel gun shy, to hear footsteps, all those phrases that people refer to, and that cannabis dials that down. So it allows the person to come back in just as though they were fresh, their body feels fresh, their mind is fresh, and they can be that top athlete that, that's the reason that they're in that position of quarterback or a pitcher or the person up at bat.
I like that when you and I were discussing this beforehand, we were talking about, like you said, the whole performance enhancing thing. And you're like, I'm not a professional athlete. I would like my performance to be enhanced on a daily
Right,
basis, right?
right, right, exactly. So that whole issue of performance enhancement really just has to do with professional athletes, and it has to do with it being unfair if one team is enhanced and the other team isn't, or one player is enhanced and the other one isn't, like with steroids. And this is very different from steroids because this really has to do with working with the endocannabinoid system and helping the mind-body connection to optimally function. And so there's a great level, when we see great athletes, like, LeBron James or someone, or the guy who, I forgot the name of the track star, Usain Bolt or something, that there's a great deal of body-mind coordination that goes on there that most of the rest of us don't ever have to be at that level, and we're not being filmed, and it's not, now or nothing sort of a situation. Um, and the ability to perform at that level is actually beneficial outside of sports. But even for people that are athletically inclined or like to exercise, the benefit for an individual, whether they're 27 years old or 72 years old, to be able to come back from a workout and not feel tired and sore or emotionally impaired because maybe they fell off of the stairmaster or something, those sorts of things. Those are a great advantage, can be of a great advantage.
I recall Michael Phelps, the Olympian swimmer. There was a lot of
Right.
talk about his cannabis use. And I think back in the day, it was like almost, oh, he won all these despite cannabis use. But it may be that he knew the secret way before the studies came out.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing because there in this culture there's a very strong association, like the old phrase, no pain, no gain. And so there's a lot of this stuff about the grunt, hard work, pain and suffering approach to excellence, and whether it's physical excellence in sports, and sometimes people even apply it to academics and career. And so that's a strong cultural overtone. And you could imagine that in another culture where people might be more relaxed, maybe in the Pacific Islands or something, that Samoan football players might not be so much into the no pain, no gain. They might be more into the, being centered and being prepared and being focused sort of thing. So sometimes they're just little simple cultural differences that then affect our assessment. But there's ample evidence that shows that when you have a person who's relaxed but present and very centered, that's when they have their optimal mind, body, performance, cognitive, athletic function, whether they're on Wall Street, selling commodities, or whether they're, on a football field. So that to be able to shift that, from the people, like when I was a kid, we would watch the Indy 500 for the crashes. People like to watch football for the pits. And, oh man, he got nailed, and so that's part of this culture. But for those people that are on the field playing, their optimal performance isn't when they're cut and injured and bleeding, and that makes them look like heroes, like the fife and drum and carrying the flag, that whole thing. It's when they're at their best, not injured, not intimidated, and also not stressed. If I could mention one little vignette, because we mentioned
Please.
patience. And so there's no proof that this is connected. It's just an example of a human experience. I once had a patient when I was back at Stanford. It was a burn patient, and I was part of the burn unit team. And the guy came in, and his story was he was from Silicon Valley, Cupertino, software engineer guy, so an intelligent guy, and he was out in the evening starting a barbecue fire to grill some stuff outside on his patio. And, squirt with the lighter fluid. The fire came up the lighter fluid bottle, boom, exploded onto him. He's covered in flames. And so, pretty obviously, not optimally, but obviously he had the thought that he needed to put the fire out and to use water. So he ran across the patio into his house, into the kitchen, and started putting the water out and going like that. And eventually put the fire out. He had pretty extensive burns. And of course, when you try to put fire out with your hands, it's like a natural reflex. It's the worst reflex for people because hands are very difficult to repair from burns. But in the process of running to the kitchen, he ran past his pool. He was only a few feet away from the pool when he was starting the barbecue. Okay. And so why didn't he see this pool? It's not because he wasn't smart enough, but somewhere in that mind-body connection, he wasn't recognizing that as the optimal solution to his problem, which it was jump in the pool, fires out. He might not even have burned his clothes. And so, but he was in a high stress survival state, high adrenaline, that sort of thing. Pain, starting to feel pain from the burns, the fear of being burned, and the association that we have from movies or childhood experiences. And so he was not in his optimal zone that he would be, say, if he was playing a computer game, and in the computer game, his character suddenly was on fire and standing next to a pool, it would like blink, and he would jump in the pool, next level. It would just be too obvious, right? And so that's part of what the endocannabinoid system helps to modulate is our emotional reaction to circumstances, our perception of the circumstances. You mentioned athletic injury, traumatic brain injury, those sorts of things. So THC and the other cannabinoids also have the effect of what's called being neuroprotective and cardioprotective, which means that when we're stressing ourselves too much, it can be physical stress, emotional stress, chemical stress. So like a person who gets hit and knocked out, that's a stress on the body. But there's a further stress if they are trying to run this brain at a high level. If they're still trying to stay in the fight or stay in the game, people might not think that that fighter is using his or her brain, but they are. And if they have to answer questions and all those, that requires energy. Those cells, those neurons are firing and making synapses, and it takes energy. They're in there working like that. And so part of it, and maybe associated with the THC relaxation response, and kind of like being like, yeah, I think I'm just going to lay here. And everybody's like, oh, that's the THC. But that's the endocannabinoid system. Part of the what's called neuroprotective effect is the person stops being so mentally engaged, so actively, physically engaged. There's at a certain level in that person, however they would describe it, they don't feel like running another mile. They don't feel like going another round of boxing. They don't feel like scoring another touchdown. They feel like laying down, and when you lay down, you get optimal perfusion to the brain, right? Instead of standing up. So, people get knocked out, they fall down. It's a protective reflex, and part of that protective reflex can be the endocannabinoid system at an emotional, behavioral level, where it's like, look, take it easy. If we can just calm your brain down, you will do a lot better with this injury than if you run around and start yelling and try and call 911 and have an argument with your kids, or all those things that start to make this thing run. So there are lots of effects in that space, and I really prefer to talk about the physiology so that we can understand who might be helped, and why these same molecules can help a person with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, depression, I guess I said Parkinson's disease already. A lot of these neurodegenerative disorders and CNS dysfunction, CNS inflammation, brain inflammation, and we start to understand those diseases better because of the effects of cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. So I prefer to start with the physiology and then look at the medical diagnoses, whereas other people say, oh, well, there's a diagnosis. Can this help this person with epilepsy, this person with Parkinson's? Can it prevent Alzheimer's? Then you have to do a study to do that. That's where a clinical trial comes in. And that clinical trial, say with Alzheimer's, it might take 20 years because you've got to start giving it to 25 and 30-year-olds and then have your parallel, group of controls that have to not use cannabis at all. Good luck.
Right.
And then get them to go the next 20 or 30 years, like the Framingham study, and keep measuring and looking at some marker of Alzheimer's, which we actually haven't nailed down because they just showed that the beta amyloid may not really be such a good biomarker. And so that's a really hard study to do, to then prove that these people that were, actively using cannabis at a certain level benefited in the long term because of a reduced incidence of Alzheimer's disease. So that's like an academic clinical trial or a drug trial. If you had a drug for that, then they would have to do that to prove that. So something like that is not likely to ever be proved with cannabis because of the expense and the discipline that's involved. And, is it really necessary? How important is it? If you say there's a connection between quitting smoking and, people that have started smoking as teenagers, but if they quit by age 30, then somebody will say, well, I wonder if that decreases their incidence of cancer or decreases their incidence of cerebrovascular disease or degenerative disease. That's an interesting question. And if you can get funding, you can do it. But do you really need to have that answer to recommend to somebody? Well, probably if you cut back on your cigarette smoking while you're still young, that would be beneficial. And actually, if you quit altogether, not only would your health be better, but you'd save a lot of money. So it has to do, when you ask about levels of evidence, how much evidence do we need to make a recommendation? And the less authoritative a physician is, and the more they share, well, the basis of my recommendation is this. This is what's going on with athletes. This is what's going on with little girls that have epilepsy. And this is what's going on with you and your inability to find a job because you keep flubbing the interview. And so here's this thing. You could actually not be optimally lined up, your mind, body. You're smart enough to get the job, but emotionally you crash at the interview. And it's like, oh, so you just want me to be high for the interview? No, that's an assumption because it's cannabis. But there's a space in between being high and being anxious. There's a lot of space in there. And your optimal sweet spot is in there somewhere. You may need to microdose to find that space. Well, is there any evidence to tell me what dose I should take? No. One, because you'd have to have 1,000 people taking a bunch of interviews in this context using the same cannabis strain, not just any cannabis, not grape gorilla kush versus dronabinol. It would have to just be one, it would just have to be elixinol. It couldn't just be a bunch of different ones in order to nail it down and to know. But if a person allows themselves to know themselves, there's this bad word nowadays. It's like, are you self-medicating? As though people don't do that every day. Every time I breathe, I'm self-medicating because oxygen technically is classified as a drug. I need more oxygen. And when I yawn, ooh, I just took a very big dose.
Overdose.
Ooh, I feel a little lightheaded. Better not get too much of that oxygen. Oxygen is psychotropic, just like sunshine. And you remember I mentioned that to you about sunshine being psychoactive because it relieves seasonal affective disorder and depression. So if you can shine sunlight on a person and change their mood, according to the WHO, that qualifies it as a psychoactive agent. So in the midst of all of this stuff, I do believe a competent adult can understand how much coffee they need in order to stay up and finish their typing assignment. And if they drink too much coffee, they won't be able to go to sleep. And that's microdosing. And so they can do the same sort of thing with an appropriate cannabis product that is reliable enough, consistent enough, perhaps standardized enough. So when they take a second sip or a third sip, and then they pick up another cup on another day, that they get sort of a consistent response. They start to know themselves and the interaction between the cannabis product and their own endocannabinoid system and their own state of well-being. And that's this thing I call optimal user interface, the interface between cannabis and an individual. And that's the thing that an individual needs to know. A physician can help them know that. But a study on 500 people in Sri Lanka or Croatia or even Kansas won't necessarily tell you or your patients what the optimal dose is for them. You can say start at 15 milligrams, start at 5 milligrams, but that's really just saying I don't know. Because it may end up being 40 milligrams. It has a large enough therapeutic window, cannabis extracts, oils, and all of that, a large enough therapeutic window where people are not likely to get into trouble with toxicity for having a dose of 50 or 100 milligrams or on up there to some relatively high levels. And you can tell that with people that become intoxicated. Okay, they may get high, but they don't overdose, they don't crash, they don't die, they don't go into respiratory depression like people do with opiates. Toxicity, if you compare cannabis to common things like coffee or even Tylenol, 4 grams of Tylenol, you're in a lot of trouble. Okay, you don't find people getting into that kind of trouble, even when they are seemingly over consuming cannabis at a Grateful Dead, Woodstock concert or something like that. You don't see them needing a liver transplant. So that means there's room enough for people who are discerning, or with the help of a health professional who's discerning, to dial in on, what's that right spot for them. And that right spot is going to change, like I said, depending on whether they're having an interview, or they're on vacation, or they're having Thanksgiving dinner with their in-laws. Those are all going to be different set points. And to say, oh, 5 milligrams is what you need, that's just kind of a ridiculous thing to even hope for.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I like that. The what did you call it? The
Full user interface.
optimal user interface. I really appreciate that because that is huge with CBD and with cannabis and a lot of these things that
Yeah,
we're talking about. The routes of administration are going to be different. Like you said, the strains are different. Everybody's body size is different. So many things to keep in
right,
mind. But I love the coffee analogy. Like we can all figure out how much caffeine we need.
right,
So let's just extrapolate that on over.
right, exactly. I mean, we have trouble with like sugary drinks, right? And a lot of people can't tell when they're drinking so many sugary drinks that they're now, 200 pounds overweight. But at a certain level, we should be able to tell. It's like, I am 40 pounds overweight and I do drink 3 supersized meals a day. It's People may not be so successful with that, but that's because somebody's pushing those drinks. But nonetheless, people, that's a pretty important health issue. Obesity is at least as important as occasional intoxication. And, like I said, responsible adults are trusted to manage their own sugar intake and fat intake. And there are all these fast food places that are promoting it. And they've even gone, it's like, this is what you crave. It's the craviest. And they've got all these things, like, we're going to get you addicted to our food. And that is allowed advertising. Those are serious, obvious, recognized health risks. And so here in this cannabis space, there is a precedent between coffee and fast food and all that it is not the more dangerous. It's probably the least dangerous out of that list that I just mentioned. So the challenge is for people to feel comfortable, to know how to proceed, again, with a well-produced, well-documented product that actually does have the amount of THC and CBD and other components that it says on the label, and not just some, snake oil.
Right, right, absolutely. Now, you talked a little bit about the physiology when we were talking about fitness, and you referred to the effects that cannabis has on aversive behavior. Is that what
Yes.
makes it helpful for people with PTSD?
Yes, for PTSD, for social dysfunction, sometimes for people that are autism spectrum. So there are many different names for a similar context. So the aversion to social rejection. And of course, physical rejection is like a very intense form of it, like getting slapped in the face or sacked as a quarterback or punched in the face. To be able to go back in there and not defend oneself and have protective behavior, yeah, it modulates that. And so last year around about this time, I gave a presentation on traumatic brain injury and CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is the end stage of the, mild chronic TBI. And what I mentioned to them was that this system may be the difference, a way of understanding the difference between, say, a boxer and someone like me, because people look at me and think that, well, that I look athletic. But if I was standing somewhere in a 10 by 10 ring and somebody punched me in the face, I would leave. I would leave the ring, I would leave the arena, and I'd go somewhere else because I don't want to get hit in the face again. Somebody hits me once, they're probably going to hit me twice. A boxer is proud that they got hit in the face and they didn't fall down. Stereotypically, the guy is proud that his girlfriend and his mom and dad are in the audience. It's like, yeah, stay in there, Charlie, stay in there. And it's, oh, he can really take a punch. Why? Because he's stronger than me, because he's conditioned himself over these years that he's a boxer, and a boxer doesn't fall down when they get punched. So there's a different, I would say, propose a different processing occurring at the higher brain centers when he receives that stimulus versus when I receive that stimulus. And for him, it's favorable. And for him, it's preferable to not fall down. So at the level of the CNS, it makes sense to me that there's processing going on and that the endocannabinoid system plays a role in that. It says, is this bad? Should we run away? Or it's no big deal. And so this sort of modulation, people refer to the endocannabinoid system as being homeostatic. For me, the error with that is that homeostasis is seen in this culture as being this ideal state that everybody should be. Female, 35, 5'8", 132 pounds, and everybody else is flawed. It's like, no, homeostasis is you take that same person and you move them to the Arctic Circle, they may want to put on a few pounds, unless they've got, all season heating and cooling in their house. But if they're out there with the Eskimos and sledding, they're likely to put on weight and change their diet, burn more calories. This human body is a smart device that's designed to function in all zones of human activity, not just the temperate climate of the United States, but the Arctic, the desert of the Sahara, the Caribbean, the Himalayan mountains with low oxygen. It's designed to be able to adapt. And so once we put it in that condition, then the homeostasis sets in. It's like, okay, do you want to be able to think clearly? Do you want to be able to run fast? What are these things that you're doing in this environment? And then how can we modulate the signals coming in from the environment to the signals coming down from the brain to the peripheral tissues so that this person, you mentioned Michael Phelps, he usually swims in a heated pool. If you throw him in the English Channel, or if he falls overboard on an Alaskan cruise next to a glacier, he still wants to be able to swim. And if he can't swim, if his muscles all cramp up, that's not ideal. So what can this body, this organism do to survive, this smart device, so that it can continue to function even though it's not in its usual habitat? So a lot of that has to do with signal processing and telling the muscles to cramp or telling them not. Telling the capillaries to clamp down and stop shunting oxygen to those muscles, or telling them it's okay. And so a lot of that is at control levels of systems that are interacting and making decisions based on prior decisions. And so all of that, just to say, kind of geeky way of saying that the endocannabinoid system allows us to modify our experience of reality and make different choices. It's okay to get punched. It's okay to get tackled. I'm here in Little League, or I'm here on the college football team, and I want to be a defensive lineman. So my life is going to be filled with a lot of bumps and bruises and all that. And if each one of those makes me running for a hug from my mom, I'm not going to make it. And so then there's an adjustment. I don't think it's just because that person is 250 pounds. There's a lot of people that are 250 pounds that never want to get hit in the face. And a boxer probably never wants to get tackled, and a football player doesn't want to get punched in the face.
Right.
So there's a lot of little fine control there in the human experience, and I just think we have given these broad, big box categories and not paid enough attention to individual humans. And that's part of the issue that I have with clinical trials, is it follows that broad, big box categorization, as opposed to looking at that individual person who is, like I said, a Wall Street investor, junior partner, law firm, interview, blind date, Thanksgiving dinner. Because that's real life. That's where they're really at.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're talking about those instances where you may be afraid to go back to a traumatic or a painful scenario. In PTSD, right. I think that's a lot of what if as far as I understand how cannabis helps, because certain situations may trigger like a flashback,
right.
and does it help? Is that where it steps in and helps prevent that, or how do you know the mechanism there?
Yes, I see reality in pictures like movies, and then I can describe it to you. So like I used to work in the tropical rainforest in the Amazon, worked with like these tribes collecting medicinal plants and all that, lived with them in the huts, for months at a time, sort of a thing. And so I realized that what we call PTSD is, again, it's a cultural issue. And a little kind of a vignette, if you imagine there's some tribe, say there's 100 people in the tribe, And out of those 100 people, there's 10 or 12 young males, right? And these young guys, aged 20 to 30 or something like that, they're out hunting. And they're hunting for meat for the tribe. And they're walking along, and then, out of a tree falls this jaguar, bites Carlos and, eats Carlos up. And the rest of the guys run away. Okay, traumatic experience. All those guys are really close. They obviously all grew up together. They've never known anybody else other than that 100 people in their lives. It's traumatic, and somebody died. Okay, well, what would the human body, this smart device that is designed to work in the Amazon and New York City and Kandahar and all these other places, what is it going to do? You don't have a Google web page to go to study leopards and jaguars and predatory cats and all those things, especially in the moment, but even afterwards. Where's the resources that they can learn? How do you learn from that experience? It's a very complex experience. The rainforest is a very complex environment. There are no right angles. There's no Fifth Street and Sixth Avenue, and it's very dense. And if unexpectedly, seemingly out of nowhere, this traumatic event happens, how does this human organism process that to their advantage to survive the next time around? You've got to be able to recognize the circumstances. But what are the conditions of that circumstance? It's a multi-dimensional array of holosensory information: what you smell, what you heard, what you felt. Was there air? Was there a breeze? All these different things. And everybody is sampling that all the time. But suddenly you become hyper aware in this life-threatening, or worse than life-threatening, traumatic experience. There it is. You don't ever want to repeat this again. And so the next time these guys are out hunting, and one of the guys says, I've got a weird feeling. And it was like, what? I don't know. It just feels bad. It's like that day when Carlos got eaten. It's like, okay, well, let's go over here. You just make this decision. We're going to go somewhere else. Well, that's appropriate to that culture. But if you have one of those guys leaves that tribe and decides to go to grad school or something in Bogota or NYU, and he's walking along and he senses that same situation and he takes off running, everybody's like, what's this guy's problem? Well, I've seen him do that before. He's having Amazon flashbacks. It's not really inappropriate. Our criticism is inappropriate because the people that have been in military or first responder experiences, their life experience was real. To me, what's weird is that somebody, some commuter, and they ride the commuter train or the ferry. My favorite example is the ferry boat. We have ferries out here, and some guy's on the boat, and a lady gets on the boat, and she's pushing a stroller, and she's got on a hat and and a scarf. It's summertime. And she gets on the boat, and just before, and I don't want to give any ideas to any potential terrorists, but just before the boat leaves the dock, she kind of eases off like she's going to the bathroom, leaves the carriage there, and goes away. 100 meters out into the, trip out into the ocean, into the Puget Sound, boom, this big bomb goes off. 20 or 30 people are harmed, killed, whatever. The boat doesn't sink. But this one guy who kind of saw everything is super traumatized. What do you think his response is going to be next time he walks into a supermarket and a lady walks in with a hat pushing a stroller? He might completely freak out. It's a trigger event. Is that inappropriate? No, because she might have a bomb. The weird thing is we live in a world where the same person who he went to school with, like there was the Columbine anniversary, the same people that these kids are going to school with, one day might show up and try and kill everybody. And then the next day, you're supposed to go back to algebra class. And so that is very different than being in the Amazon. In the Amazon, that sound is a jaguar, and you run or you pull out your spear, and it's a little bit more consistent. We have a super diverse, super complex environment that we're applying this primordial nervous system to, trying to manage life or death situations in contexts where we are supposed to feel safe. So the PTSD thing is absolutely spot on. All those people are right. They're having the appropriate response, and we're not supporting them. Well, not all of us. Some of us are not supporting them, but some people are. The cannabis can help to support the person by helping to erase, if you will, aversive memories, so that when this guy from the Amazon is in grad school in New York, if he can erase the association he has with that smell and a rush of leaves and that sound like this, and that can be eliminated, then he will no longer go racing off in the middle of the street as though he's being chased by a jaguar. The challenge is, though, when he goes home, he's not going to have that reflex. And everybody's going to like, you've been gone too long. You're weird. You're not one of us anymore. You seem like a New York guy. And see, so that to me is like, oh, that kind of makes sense. It's part of human experience. Sometimes we overanalyze things scientifically and we forget about the wisdom of our own human experience and realize, yeah, that makes sense. And this is kind of how things work. And it takes people time to dial back. So cannabis can help us to readjust to the new reality that we want to be. I want to be an urban New York grad student. It's like, okay, that's fine. We'll erase this connection and this neural association. But when you go back home for Christmas, you're going to need a chaperone. Don't go walk in the forest by yourself. So to me, that all makes perfect sense. And I think it's wonderful that there's this amazing complex plant that's as complex as our lives are, and is so helpful, so safe, and so widely available to people. So I really want us to really learn how to use it wisely, and get beyond a lot of these kind of boxes and categories and prejudices.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned earlier that it has neuroprotective properties, and that's why it's good for Alzheimer's and some of the other brain conditions. And then you mentioned that it's also helpful for anxiety and depression. What is
Right.
the physiology behind that?
So there are two aspects. One is neuroprotection, and the other one is neuroinflammation. So the neuroprotection is an effect associated with the endocannabinoid system. The mitochondria are the little organelles inside of cells that are the energy generators. And it has the effect of dialing them down so that that cell simply cannot be driven as hard. It's kind of like if you rent a U-Haul truck, they've got a governor on the engine, so you can't go 100 miles an hour. You can only go 50. You can't go over the speed limit. So when somebody has a traumatic brain injury, mild or moderate, severe, you want to dial down that maximum speed limit, that maximum energy level, so that it is compatible with life, but it's then therefore neuroprotective. With respect to neuroinflammation, there's a lot of data, a lot of studies showing connections between inflammation and mood disorders like depression, for example. Also, say, for instance, inflammatory bowel syndrome, but also inflammation has a connection with cancer. Obviously, inflammation is connected with arthritis, but there's a recent study, I think it was last year, that came out showing the high prevalence of depression among older U.S. adults with arthritis. Inflammation gets communicated back and forth between the central nervous system and the body. The old thought of the brain as being this isolated, like the king and queen in the castle behind the walls that no one can reach, it really isn't true. There's a lot of back and forth communication. And so when there's inflammation in the gut, then there are inflammatory mediators that end up being present in the brain that can generate inflammation. The challenge is sometimes what's going on in the gut, we don't want to have manifest in the brain. And again, I think a lot of that is these kind of weird lifestyles that we have. It's like a person who wants to be on edge, like I said, because they are on Wall Street and they're on the floor, or whatever they call it, dealing commodities, and they're in rush hour traffic, but they don't want to have a heart attack. It's like, well, wait a minute. The system is set up this way, and it's a smart device, but when you click this button, it's going to do this thing. So the inflammation, and also because a lot of the serotonin that helps to modulate mood and depression is generated, 95% I think it is, in the human digestive tract. So when people have an imbalance, even just of their microbiome, it can have emotional effects. But when there is inflammation going on in the brain, then there is a depressive effect. Some people postulate that it's actually, again, a protective sort of human organism, smart device effect, because depression makes people less social, less active, less outgoing. And so, in the primitive situation, the guy in the rainforest is less likely to go out hunting, which means if he's not at his optimal best because something is going on in his brain, whether it's inflammation like from a viral infection or it's just some form of weird depression he has left over from being a grad student in New York, and you don't want him going out there because he's going to be at higher risk for getting caught by the next jaguar that shows up. If he's depressed, he's going to say, yeah, you guys go ahead. I'm just going to stay here and, check Facebook and Twitter or something, and so there are some people, kind of social anthropologists or whatever they're called, I don't know which group they are, but they postulate that the depression, because it's called malaise, it's a very old word, when people just they have a cold or they have arthritis, they don't feel like doing anything, they're less active, they're less fun to be around, but it also gives the body a chance to repair, and it puts them at less risk for additional harm or injury. And so the challenge is, if we're honest with ourselves about our life and our lifestyles and the state of health that we want to be in, then we need to eliminate the predators in our lives so that we don't have this PTSD that we have to erase, that we have to dial up our cognitive level with caffeine and then dial it down in the evening with Ambien. And so there's all of this conflicting physiology going on, and the endocannabinoid system is trying to find that sweet spot of homeostasis in there where everything goes well in life. But, some people are, they run electron microscopes during the day and they're like this. And then at the end of the day, they want to go out and run and sprint and exercise. And it's like, oh God, what kind of human is that? The endocannabinoid system is like, so is this like a Viking warrior or is this a librarian? I'm not sure which archetype, which operating system level should we set this person at. So anyway, I think we present a lot of challenges to our endocannabinoid systems, but that association that you're mentioning with inflammation, you also see a connection between depression and cancer. And it's not specifically associated with a stage or the prognosis, but it's specifically associated with depression and cancer, to the point where sometimes it has been postulated that perhaps the depression can precede the cancer diagnosis, because the process of the cancer is going on inside someone's body. The molecular signaling is running throughout the body. What's going to be that first sign? Is it going to be a lump in the breast, or is it going to be a change of mood? Somebody who used to be very productive, like a writer for New York Times, and now is missing deadlines, well, you can ramp them back up with an antidepressant, but you might want to, go and check a few biomarkers for cancer in that person. So that is, to me, a very interesting space, perhaps because it's so complex. But that connection between those different conditions of neurodegenerative diseases, of depression and anxiety, of digestive issues, centers around the context of inflammation, and the CB2 receptors and CB1 receptors affect the immune system and the inflammatory response. And so, like I said, this is a very generous plant. It's come in and is helping. It's like, the stereotypical old movie when the grandmother would move into the house, and because mom is pregnant with the fourth kid and can't stay at work, and grandma can do everything. She cooks better than mom. She keeps the house clean. She tells funny stories, and she keeps dad from staying out all night at the bar. And suddenly the whole family is better because grandma or the nanny or whatever is there. And that, to me, is kind of like this plant is doing all this stuff. It's not just helping with the cancer. So recognize that, again, to take an archetypal patient, some 30-year-old junior law partner, recent grad from, Cornell Law School, who's trying to become a senior partner at a New York, Midtown Manhattan law firm, and is making presentations and feeling stressed and these things. And so, from time to time has to give a presentation to the senior partners and feel stressed. And somebody says, hey, you should try CBD, or for the context of our podcast today, not just CBD, but a full spectrum cannabis oil that may help you with anxiety, depression, and risk aversion and fear of social rejection. Try it today. 15 milligrams, 1 dropper full. Anyway, if that person does that and it's effective and useful for her, are we just treating her anxiety and depression? No, we're impacting inflammation throughout her body. That anxiety and depression might predispose her to IBS, IBD further down the road. Also, the connection between the inflammation and cancer. We may be helping to prevent her future or diminish her future breast cancer risk by treating her anxiety today. And then all sorts of other things, Alzheimer's, divorces, whatever, all of these things. It's like, and so people say, oh, you're trying to say it's a panacea. It is. I'll go on the record. Cannabis is a panacea, but there's a reason, because anytime you affect something new, when there's something that is novel, that's completely undiscovered territory, it will suddenly solve lots of problems that you weren't able to solve before. Like Tesla and electricity at the turn of the previous century. Suddenly there's a lot of things. Look at all the things we've applied electricity to in the last 125 years. That's a panacea. You take that electricity away, and everybody's like, "Oh, we'll be back in the dark ages." But people did fine with gas lights, but there would maybe a whole city would burn down because of the fire component, and the electricity doesn't. So it's a panacea. We've just discovered the endocannabinoid system. So cannabis, working with that, is suddenly showing us, hey, I can help with this pain, and I can help with that inflammation, and yeah, I can impact that disease. And it looks like a panacea, a cure-all, because these are things we weren't able to cure before, that suddenly now we have a grasp on and we can make progress on. So that's only natural as you advance in medicine. Like antibiotics were a panacea for a long time. Vaccines were a panacea for a long time. Hand washing was a panacea for a long time. Aspirin, so we're just in a great new, horizon, embarking on a new adventure into a new world of discovery about ourselves and health and prevention of disease. And so it makes sense that something that's this dynamic and this powerful in a system, in a cannabinoid system that's running all the other systems in the body. It's the operating system running the central nervous system, immune system, digestive, cardiovascular, reproductive, all these other systems. And we just discovered it. Yeah, there's a lot of things we still have to learn about just being human and being life running this smart device.
Well, I love that wrap up. I think that's beautiful, and that does put a lot of it in context for people who are like, "But it says it can cure everything." You're like, "Well, it's doing its best because, like you said,
Yeah.
if inflammation is at the root of so many things, and it's a great, powerful anti-inflammatory, then obviously it's going to have those secondary effects." So, thank you for clarifying that, and thank you so much for
You're welcome.
coming on. Thank you for coming on and sharing all of this wisdom and your stories, and I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Well, I'm glad that it's helpful.
Yeah,
I hope I didn't stray off topic too much.
no, and it was beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us, and for everyone else. Until next time.